Welcome to the Health from the Source podcast, where we're dedicated to educating people about health, ancestral nose-to-tail nutrition, regenerative agriculture, and the interplay between environment, health, and sustainability.
Welcome back. And in this episode, we're going to be talking everything fat. And I'm one that loves cooking with fat, and that's purely because of the taste. And I use obviously tallow, which is rendered beef fat from the internal fats within the animal. But Richard, you're going to know an awful lot more about the nutritional benefits and also the history of animal fats, which has been maligned for a very long time. But a lot of new data is coming out to show that a lot of the studies in the past weren't as accurate as they should have been.
Yep, that's correct. We'll dive into that a little bit. And I think first and foremost, definitely from a flavor perspective, nothing beats animal-based fats. Tallow, obviously, most savory, but even good old butter and everything else. All the things we used to use. And traditionally, when we go back, again, from an ancestral health perspective, we didn't have all the processed and industrialized things that we have now. So we had to utilize what we had. And we mostly use a lot of animal-based products. So that would have been things like tallow, or when we figured out how to make butter and those types of things. Even whale blubber back in the day was used for many different things. But in I think it was around maybe the 60s or 70s, I might get the dates wrong there, we started to use modern science to approach how we should look at nutrition. Right? So using the scientific method, and obviously a lot has changed since then. But in the early days, one of the big hallmark studies that really was one of the reasons why we moved away from animal-based foods was the 7 country studies by Ansel Keys. And this has been really well broken down in Nina Teicholz's book called The Big Fat Lie. So highly recommend anyone who's still unsure about fats, and even after today when we've gone through the details, if you're still unsure, there's a really good book to read. I'd highly recommend jumping on that. And we'll talk about a couple other researchers too to look at. But basically what happened around this time when this study came out is he looked at countries around the world, and they were trying to investigate what was the cause of heart disease. And initially they actually looked at more than 7 countries. They looked at quite a few, but eventually they, we could say they cherry picked, which some people are saying now, but they pulled out some data which showed somewhat of a correlation between animal-based fats and increased saturated fat consumption and heart disease. And so based off of this research, we really moved away from that, and everyone kind of bought into the idea that saturated fat was the cause of heart disease. And now there's quite a lot of literature questioning if that's really the case. And even things like cholesterol used to be something that we thought was a problem. And this is going back a couple of years now. It happened kind of quietly, but all of the heart associations, like the American Heart Association and a few other dietary guidelines, removed the restriction of dietary cholesterol intake because there was no data to support that it was actually causative or even correlated to any type of cardiovascular disease or heart disease. So there's no longer a limit on cholesterol intake. And the body regulates that quite naturally. So if you consume more, it downregulates its own production. And if you're consuming less, it upregulates its own production. And most of the cholesterol in your body, you can actually produce. And maybe before even talking about that, we should mention maybe what cholesterol is and what fats are. So cholesterol is a particular molecule based on its shape that provides a specific structure that can be bound, particularly in cell membranes and things of that nature. But it also has this sort of round octagonal shape that lends itself to being able to produce lots of other things. So we produce a lot of our sex hormones from it. We produce vitamin D from it. So cholesterol is really very important. All of our nerves in the sheath that's around the nerves, we need cholesterol for that. So it's a very important component. Fat's up there as well. So fat usually are fatty acids. It's a type of chemical compound which has a glycerol backbone with some fatty acids in there. And these are really important for a host of different things. We use fats for energy. We use fats in our cell membranes. We use fats across our entire metabolism and our entire body. So again, there are certain essential fatty acids that we need and some that are non. So this is something that we do actually need to consume in our diet to stay alive and stay healthy. So that right there should tell us that if they're essential and we need a certain amount, then obviously we need to get them in our diet, and we need to look at the foods where we get those most abundant. But coming back to that Ansel Keys aspect, after that research came out, they they started to look at this a little bit more, and there was some more research that sort of supported it. And it's a bit of a rolling effect where they build on previous research. So now there's a finding, and so they're going to build more on that finding, instead of sometimes questioning, analyzing what that original data was, and maybe there's a different reason. And a lot of the early research around saturated fats and fats was something called epidemiology. And epidemiology, when we look at science and the levels of evidence in science, it's really the lowest, one of the lowest rungs. Opinion and expert opinion probably is below it, but epidemiology is basically where we're looking back in time, or we're looking across a really big population, and then we're trying to get some subjective information from them. So usually when it comes to nutrition, they're asking things like a food frequency questionnaire. They're asking people to remember what they ate previously, and then we look at where their disease is in the future. And obviously there's a lot of issues with that because people often don't remember well. They misrepresent what they actually had for food. But one of the big problems with epidemiology is this aspect of correlation doesn't mean causation, right? So
Yeah.
just because there's a correlation of something doesn't mean that that particular thing caused what we're looking at. So in this instance, saturated fat, cholesterol, and heart disease. And there's a few big players. I think we might have mentioned it on an early one, something like the healthy user bias. So that's where other components of someone's lifestyle may be a factor of them having less disease risk. So maybe they work out more, maybe they have less stress, those types of things. And we need to confound and assess for those to see if it's those that are making the difference, or is it the cholesterol or saturated fat. And a lot of the recent research now, when they're accounting for some of these confounding variables, there seems to be much less compelling evidence that saturated fat or just a high fat diet in general is causative of heart disease. There are aspects of high LDL, which a lot of people are still debating. LDL being, I think what most people know is that quote unquote bad cholesterol, and HDL, you're good. There is some data to show in some people saturated fat may raise that, but then we need to ask the question, is it really LDL is the problem, or is there something else? So it still comes back to that correlation or causation. And there's a bit of a heated debate in the space. The consensus, I think, for a lot of people is LDL is not necessarily great. We don't want it too high, but some people are questioning that now, both in the medical and research space. So it's a ever growing evolution. Nutrition is still young, like we talked about previously, but that's sort of where a lot of this started, and where a lot of our food guidelines have come from. I think now we're getting better with our research, better with our science, and we're going to start to learn more. Does that kind of give a general consensus and cover the history there? Are there any things for our listeners that maybe I should dive into a bit more?
Yeah. The other thing that it's always been a little bit interesting, particularly talking about the food pyramid, which is what you're alluding to, is the politics that sits behind it as well. There's a lot of industries that want to be recommended because it means that more consumers will buy their products and so forth from there. So um, I understand that some of the other industries were quite keen to fill the gap of the bad fat that was coming from animal fats, and that actually fueled the growth of a lot of very large industries today was on the basis of these decisions, and they actually became quite political about what was to be taught in education systems as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely been a big component of, let's say, misaligned or malaligned incentives, and there has been evidence that's come out of, certain corporations paying for research or supporting research, certain researchers found to have conflicts of interests by being paid by certain corporations and companies. So this is definitely a big problem in science in general. It's not a perfect tool, sadly. I'm pretty sure a lot of the early days of this research and the production of the food guidelines, there was a lot of lobbying and a lot of money going behind supporting certain things, because we could produce really cheap and easy food in these processed types of foods. And this is sort of the advent, which rolls quite well into the advent of seed oils, vegetable and seed oils. So things like Crisco all of a sudden came out, and we started using what used to be really machine lubricants and these sort of things that we would throw out or use for other industrial purposes, we started to turn them into food. So things like canola, cottonseed oil, rapeseed oil, sunflower oil, a lot of these things which we generally didn't really consume because, again, traditionally we wouldn't have been able to. These things need to go through an immense amount of industrial processing to go from a tiny little seed with not much oil in it to produce all of those, squeeze them down, get the oil out, then clean it. They go through a whole bunch of chemical processes to deodorize, to pretty much change the whole chemical makeup of it, and then eventually into food. And so we moved away from these animal based foods into these. They started to become much more accessible, much cheaper. They could put it in everything. We also started to have the processed grains and carbohydrates, like we talked about in the ancestral health perspective, where we started to eat a lot of those foods. And so they started producing these food like products, which were very cheap, calorie dense, again, not very nutrient dense. And so there was a really good business opportunity to start pushing these types of foods, which were proprietary or trademarked or whatever, so that no one else could actually make them. And you had sort of the only way of producing them and making money off of them. So we went away from the things that we always had into these highly industrial processed types of foods. And the vegetable and seed oils is another area where there's a lot of contention at the moment because the early research in alignment with the research against saturated fat showed when we replace that with polyunsaturated fats, which are more in these vegetable and seed oils, there seem to be some improvements in overall health, but they're usually looking at that reduction in LDL. And so a lot of this needs to be questioned now. And this is where ancestral health gives a really nice first principles perspective at looking at nutrition. It seems somewhat counterintuitive to think about foods that we've consumed for tens of hundreds of thousands of years suddenly causing all of the disease we see in the modern day. It doesn't make sense to me. I would think more, what are the things that we've changed and added, and definitely moving away from animal-based fats into these processed vegetable and seed oils has been one of the biggest things. And with that, initially, like Crisco and margarine and these types of foods, they were extraordinarily high in trans fats. And this was before we had the research that showed how bad trans fat was. And so we moved away from these healthy animal-based fats into these highly trans fats. And now, as most people know, we've pretty much banned that across the board. There's a very low limit of trans fat that's allowed because it's so detrimental to our health, particularly our cardiovascular health. So we've definitely shifted quite far. I think we're starting to come back the other way, and the research will continue to grow. One other big proponent in this space is Dr. Zoe Harcombe. She's a PhD research in public health, but went down into nutrition, and she's really done a deep dive into the whole fats space. And she's actually published quite a few papers on the topic, sort of trying to break up a lot of this myth and perhaps misconceptions around saturated fat, cholesterol, and animal-based fats. And so we definitely see people shifting more that way, and I think the research will start to move in that direction more as well.
Yeah, so quite often science just isn't science.
Yeah, look, it's a good tool. It's the best tool we have, but it's not a
Mm.
perfect tool, right? Unfortunately, there's still humans
It's
that
the
are behind it.
interpretation that's the key part.
Yeah, interpretation, again, greed, bias. We all succumb to our own biases. If anyone's read Thinking Fast and Slow, there's a lot of heuristics and things that we function off. So even the smartest and most intellectual of us are still prone to errors and biases as well. So we got to try to control for that, and we're getting better and better. And that's where we need to look at more modern research versus the old research. And yeah, the old research, which seems to be lower quality, showed maybe animal-based fats, saturated fat weren't as good. But now we've got better research that's showing that might not be the case. And so we need to consider that. And like most things, it takes quite a lot of time, especially in medicine, for the research to disseminate its way down to the clinicians. And it's starting to come out, but usually it's few that are staying up to date. Many doctors and specialists and things don't necessarily have the time to read every paper that comes out. And so, yeah, they rely on whatever general consensus is there, and that takes time to shift and change. Yeah, that's kind of where we're at as far as the research perspective goes for now.
So tell me about some of the specific benefits of tallow and animal-based fats.
Yep. So one thing, we've talked about saturated fat a lot. It actually does serve a role and a purpose. We need a certain amount of saturated fat in our diet. Saturated fat, when we look at the different types of fatty acids, we can run from saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. And this is basically how many double bonds are within that chain of fatty acids. Saturated, there's pretty much none. Mono, there's one. Polyunsaturated, there's many. And so that's what differentiates those types of fats. And it changes the structure and it changes the shape of the tail. And saturated fat, because it has pretty much none, it's nice and straight. And that straightness means it can be stacked on top of each other and become really dense and really firm. And that's why most saturated fats at room temperature are usually solid. Things like butter, tallow, ghee, etc. They're going to be quite hard and quite solid. The more we move along that polyunsaturated, they become more viscous and more fluid. And saturated fat, we need that mix. So we need some rigidity, but we also need some fluidity. We need a bit of both. It's always about that balance, right? So for that component, we need some there. There's actually some modern research now looking at men, particularly where a low saturated fat may be implicated in low testosterone. So we see as that goes down, we seem to see lower testosterone, and that's in a dose dependent manner. So as it goes up with it, right? And as it goes down with it. So there's clearly a need for saturated fat in the diet. We can't be too low. There probably is a too high level with it as well, but that too high level has probably been overstated at the moment. I think as research comes out, we'll show that we can actually have a good amount of it in our diet. So beyond just the saturated fat component of tallow and animal-based fats, there's a lot of other beneficial effects. So if people are familiar, we've got our vitamins and minerals. Within the vitamins, we have water soluble and fat soluble. And fat soluble, like the name suggests, it usually comes in a medium of fat. And so without that in the diet, we're not going to get some of these fat soluble vitamins. Those are A, D, E, and K. And funny enough, these are a lot of the vitamins which are increasingly high rates of deficiency in the modern world. So we have to consume these types of fats to get those fat soluble vitamins. Vitamin A, we don't get much of anymore. Most people think of vitamin A, they think beta carotene, but like we talked about on our last episode, that plant version isn't the same. And it's the same with vitamin K. Vitamin K comes in different forms. We've got K1, K2. There's a whole breakdown of different types of K2. The K2 seems to have more health benefits, and that's predominantly only in animal-based sources, barring natto, which if anyone's had natto, I've not tried it, but it sounds like not the best food to consume. So we get a lot of our fat-soluble vitamins from fats, and particularly animal-based fats. So again, another important concept there. When we look at key, maybe we'll stay on the fat-soluble vitamins. There are really important aspects of each of those vitamins there. And again, you have to get them. Plant sources are not going to be the best. Each has a particular role. Vitamin A is really good for skin, the immune system. It's good for hormonal health and fertility. There's a host of things for it. Vitamin D, really, really important. So we can get some from the diet. Mostly we get it from sunlight, but we need the cholesterol and certain cofactors for it to convert into vitamin D in our body. That supports the immune system, supports bone health. We're learning more and more now about the benefits of vitamin D, particularly post sort of COVID and those things where we saw people with vitamin D deficiency had a lot of issues with their immune system and overall metabolic health. Vitamin E we can get from actually plant-based sources, but we'll get it from some animal source as well. And then vitamin K, I think, is a really interesting one. It's a relatively new vitamin, at least in the research space. And this is one that was called, I think, Factor X by the book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration that I talked about earlier, where they were looking at this immaculate bone and dental health for people. And what the gentleman who wrote the book thought was there was a certain factor that seemed to be why they had such good bone and dental health. Well, what they think is that was actually vitamin K. And vitamin K is important for actually telling calcium where to go in your body. So that's really important for cardiovascular health because we don't want calcium in our blood vessels. We want it in our bones. And there's some research now looking at potential roles in cancer and other types of diseases and conditions. And vitamin K, another one of the ones where most people are going to be quite low in a traditional Western diet. There's very few sources where people are going to be getting that from, unless they're supplementing or something like that. But we can get that from liver and many other organs. Liver is probably one of the better sources of it. And so traditionally, no-till eating, we always got these types of foods. And from other types of fats, there are particular fats in especially tallow and some other animal-based products, but tallow has a very high CLA content. And CLA was quite a darling supplement quite a while ago because there's research to show that it has potential cardiovascular benefits. And this again goes somewhat counter to what we were looking at before, where high saturated fat foods seem to be the cause of cardiovascular disease, but yet things high in CLA and supplementing CLA seems to be protective for cardiovascular disease. So the high CLA content is one component. And there's another interesting fat, which I've only really been familiar with for maybe about a year or two, which is stearic acid. And stearic acid is another somewhat paradoxical fat, at least from the traditional sense that most people would think, in that it seems to boost metabolism and enhance fat burning. So it's this idea of consuming a particular type of fat may improve fat loss and overall metabolic health, which goes counter because some people would think if I consume fat, I'm going to get fat. But funny enough, it's not really what we see. In fact, usually quite the opposite. If we move away from fat and do a very high carbohydrate diet, like we talked about with cattle and things there where we get the marbling, tends to be more fat causing just because of the changes in metabolism, insulin signaling, and the way that the body uses that, and also gets function or gets converted in the liver. So there's some really, really important and interesting fats between CLA, stearic acid. We've got all the fat soluble vitamins, and then we've got the important aspects of just the general energy and importance of overall healthy fats in the diet from an animal-based source.
So that's good to know that the fat and the emerging science is actually showing that it's actually really good for our bodies. How do you use it? How do you use it in your diet?
Yep, good question. Obviously, for cooking, it's great for that perspective. So anything roasting, things of that nature, it's fantastic. And one nice thing is we've got our infused tallow range, which no one else really has. So if you want to add a bit of flavor, it's got infused flavors of rosemary, garlic, or ginger, turmeric. So say like roasting potatoes, pretty much my go-to is always with tallow. There's nothing like roasted potatoes on tallow. But one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet, with the high saturated fat content, it actually makes it really heat stable. And so using things like tallow for any type of frying or high heat cooking is preferential because it's more stable against that heat. Other types of fats, like the polyunsaturated fats, even olive oil at high heats, can become rancid, and it becomes quite toxic. So you actually don't want to be cooking on a high heat with those. So you can use it for frying. Traditionally, I think it was McDonald's, they talk about even used to use tallow in their fryers back in the day before we had this whole kick against animal-based fats. And so anything high heat is great. Roasting is easy. Those are probably the main things I use it for. And one of the other
Of
areas
course,
where a
with
lot
a
of,
steak
of course, depends how you're cooking it. If
on the
you're grilling
barbecue.
it, yeah, if you're on the
Yeah,
barbecue, maybe a bit of a rub on through there. If
yeah.
you do it in the pan actually is really good. So you can have a bit of tallow there. I know I've done it before. I'll actually just take a spoonful, depending on what you need. People who are sort of keto and in that space where they need a really high fat content, we're talking, less than 10% carbohydrates in their diet, which means they have to consume a very high amount of fat. They'll just spoon other types of fat, coconut oil, tallow, whatever it is, because they need the extra calories and calorie density from the fats. So you can sometimes just spoon it. That's an easy way of getting in it if you need the calories. I've always been a skinny guy, so I need the extra calories. Um, but one way people use it as well is not even just ingesting it, but topical. There's a lot of people now creating all sorts of tallow products, so you can use it as a skin balm, completely natural, nothing synthetic in it, no fragrances, no chemicals, nothing. You just need a little bit of tallow. You can rub it on the area. anecdotally, people are seeing improvements in things like psoriasis, eczema, that type of stuff where they've got quite dry
Mm.
skin. Just a simple rub of tallow can be really good. And there's a lot of companies coming out now using tallow products all across, but you can just get our straight normal tallow and use that as a topical balm. How do you use tallow? What's your go-to recipes?
Um, I've got a fryer that I just put the tallow in there, so we use that on occasion. The kids are pretty keen on tallow fries from there, which I know is a carbohydrate, so we don't have it all that often, but that's pretty tasty. And yeah, so I used to years ago use olive oil for cooking the steaks, and it just gives it an olive flavour. Where really I'm actually after the beef flavour, and
Yep,
there's nothing better than getting the tallow on the steaks. And the one real key benefit that I can find with that is that um, I can get a really good sear on the steak because I can get the barbecue hot enough without it turning into a smoking mess if I use different oils from there. So I can get it really hot. So then you can get that beautiful sear on
nice
the steak
sear.
on there as well. So I actually get a bit more versatility out of my barbecue as well. So that's one of the benefits. And I use the flavored ones often in stir fry as well. So for the protein that I'm putting through there with beef stir fry strips or even chicken stir fry strips, you can get it really hot, so you can get that protein nice and crispy without excessive smoking going through everything as well. So
Yeah, and it's got
yeah,
such a nice savory flavor to it as well. So anything I find anything savory, it just goes perfectly with it.
yep. And the next thing I'm going to try is making soap out of tallow, which
Yes,
is again a
I've
traditional
tried one
fabric.
actually. I've had a tallow
Have
soap
you?
before. I didn't make it, but I've tried another range. It worked quite well, and that's traditionally what they use. So for a lot of
Mm,
things, we used what we had available because we couldn't again industrially process all of these things. So we used tallow, blubber, those types of things for soap, for shampoos, for even
candle.
lanterns, candles. We used it
Mm,
for absolutely everything. It was a fantastic product for that. I realize one thing we probably haven't mentioned, which would be good to go into just briefly here, is what tallow is. We talked a bit about tallow from the perspective of it's from the kidney fat and some of the caul fat that gets rendered down, but Provenir is producing this. Maybe if you took a couple minutes to explain to people how we go from that kidney fat and caul fat down to a tallow product and some of the important things that I guess separate quality from how it's being made.
yeah, so the manufacturing process, as opposed to the cottonseed oil or the rape and so forth, it is really really simple. So in the process, we harvest the suet and coal fat, and that goes straight into a plastic lined box, which we do about 20 kilos into a box, and then that gets chilled straight away. From there, it's returned back to our further food manufacturing facility, where the tallow it's quite hard by that stage. It's a big, basically block of fat, um, and we put it through a mincer. To It comes out as sort of shavings of fat, and then from that we put it into a large rendering vessel, which is basically like a very large pot. And the key thing with the rendering process is to not get it over 90 degrees, because we want to ensure that we haven't pre-cooked it before people use it for cooking. And that way we ensure that the nutritional benefit that's in the tallow is maintained. So basically, it's not even cooking, it's really just putting it into a liquid form as well. So when we go through that process, any impurities will rise to the top that may have come through the harvesting process. So they get removed from the tallow, and then we'll drop it down to about 60 degrees. And then we'll put it through a couple of fine filters. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of particulate matter that comes through the process, so that removes all of that, and then it's just straight into sterilized glass jars, and that's it. That's the process.
Yep,
So
easy.
it's really just a very, very gentle process. We don't add any other um, components to make it smell different or smell nice or anything like that. It is just pure beef fat that's been purified.
Yep. And people can make it at home. You can make your own tallow. It is a bit of a process. So obviously we have it in a nice, easy format. But the thing is, if we compare, and maybe I'll see if I can find a video to put in the show notes, if you compare the processing of vegetable and seed oils and see what goes into making those products, which I don't know how they're made for food consumption, and you compare that to the ease and straightforwardness of just making tallow by slowly rendering it down into a liquid, and that's about it. It's a stark difference into what is a food and what is not a food. So yeah, it's a eye-opening thing to watch those videos.
And surprisingly, there is so few companies making this fat. I think there's a grand total of 3 in Australia. And what we're seeing now is that this ancestral nutritional focus and just going back to eating unprocessed foods is really gaining traction, and I think that's been based on the empirical evidence of people just feeling better. Like,
Yeah,
they try the diet, and the easiest diet to maintain is one that just makes you feel good
yep,
and is easy to do. you know.
yep, extraordinary. It's funny because there is this perspective of people make some of these dietary shifts and they feel better, everything looks better, even a lot of their blood work gets better, their energy get better, everything gets better. But especially when we're talking about these animal-based fats, their LDL might go up a bit, and then their doctor freaks out and tells them to stop, even though, again, empirically everything is moving in the right direction. But because of this one marker, which, as we said, some of the evidence may suggest it's been overstated into its causative factor of disease, they'll throw everything out with the bathwater. And it's really unfortunate. So I think we do see that movement coming, and it's a bit of a grassroots movement. People are going to make their own choices based on how they feel. And if they're feeling better, then I think that will continue to move it forward. And hopefully that brings more research to the table too. And I think there are more people that are looking into this as a better way of eating, and really starting to narrow down into some of the research to see, yeah, maybe we were wrong and maybe we need to reconsider, and fat isn't so bad.
Well, in my mind, it's bloody delicious. And yeah, as a scientist, I can see that the evidence is definitely showing that all the bad press that it had for such a long time is being debunked, which means that we need new science to actually really understand this a whole lot better.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I will put a couple of the research papers and things that we've mentioned in the show notes for people to dive into it a little bit more so they can see what's going on in that space. But we can probably end it there for that one. And then we've got one more episode where on our last one, we're going to sort of revisit our whole approach to ethical and sustainable food, and what the future brings towards the table of what both we're going to do across Provenir and Vital Origin, and what we hope to see in the entire industry moving forward from here.
Look forward to it.
Excellent. We'll chat then. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. And if you're looking to add in nature's most nutrient-dense foods back into your diet, be sure to check out vitalorigin.com.au and use coupon SOURCE10 at checkout for an extra 10% off. We'll see you guys on the next episode.